Do you believe in miracles? Have you ever wondered what happens when medicine says there is no way out, but God decides to act? This is one of those stories that moves the soul. A woman as common as you and me hears a sentence from doctors that no one wants to hear. There is no cure. It was as if the ground had disappeared from beneath our feet. Everything fell apart. Dreams, plans, peace. Everything was gone in a matter of seconds. How many times do we think we've tried everything? That there is no longer a solution, that the exams are definitive, that the diagnosis is the end. But what if I told you that does God write stories when the world says period? This woman was at the height of her despair. I cried alone, I questioned, I sought strength where there was none. She was not incredulous, she even had faith. But at that moment, it seemed like God was silent. Maybe you've already felt this way, abandoned, weak, no answers. Looking at the sky and asking, Lord, have you forgotten me? This story is for you, for those who are at their limit, for those who have thought about giving up, for those who feel that their prayers are not being heard. But pay attention, God is not late. He works in the invisible, and when he acts, the impossible bends before his will. What happened to this woman will challenge everything you believe about human boundaries. Why science gave the diagnosis, but God had the last word. And we are not talking about something symbolic, emotional or psychological. We are talking about a real, proven, visible miracle, something that left doctors confused, family members on their knees, and a testimony that can never be erased. But before I tell you what God did, you need to understand this woman's pain, because it's easy to celebrate healing. The difficult part is going through the desert, and it was in this desert that she discovered something that changed everything. Get ready, because from now on, you will enter a story where pain screams, faith is tested, and God's answer comes unexpectedly. Stay until the end. This story is not just about her. It could very well be about you. Get ready. Because from now on you will enter a story where pain screams, faith is tested, and God's answer comes unexpectedly. Stay until the end. This story is not just about her. It could very well be about you. But before continuing, let me give you a warning. What you are hearing is not just a testimony of overcoming, it's a sign. We are living through difficult days, and if you pay attention, you will realize that many are already losing hope, as if everything is out of control. But God continues to act, in silence, in the secret, in the details. And stories like this are proof that his time is still running, but not for much longer. This is why it is so important to be aware. Many do not see what is happening around them, but you who are here now need to be awake, because God's action is also a warning, a calling, a reminder that the days are getting shorter and miracles are still God's way of saying, I'm here, there's still time. So if you feel that this message has something to do with you, don't ignore it. Like this video now, because this simple gesture helps this message reach more people who are on edge, people who may not even have the strength to ask for help. Subscribe to the channel, because here each story has a purpose. Each testimony is a seed of faith, a reminder that God still turns tears into healing, pain into renewal, impossible things into new beginnings. Don't wait for the perfect moment. The time is now. God is speaking, and perhaps he is using this story to remind you, I'm still the same, and I'm closer than you know. She was young, full of dreams, wife, mother of 2 young children. She led an ordinary life, surrounded by the laughter of children running around the house, the plans she made with her husband for the future, and that silent hope that every woman carries in her heart, that despite the struggles of everyday life, everything will work out. But suddenly, everything changed. The pain began as temporary discomfort, easily ignored, but persistent. At first, she thought it was tiredness, perhaps the stress of the heavy routine. After all, being a mother, a wife, and also dealing with household commitments demands more than the body can handle. But the pain intensified. They began to steal your peace, your sleep, your energy. And, even worse, they began to steal your joy. The doctor said it was nothing. Maybe it's just exhaustion. Let's wait a little longer. Rest up. But she knew it wasn't normal. That feeling that something was wrong grew inside her like a shadow. Until the tests came, and with them the sentence, a rare and incurable disease. It was as if the floor disappeared. Suddenly, everything that was certain became uncertain. The plans she made for the future with her children seemed to disappear before. Her eyes, life, which once had color, was dyed into a suffocating gray. She felt like she was being pushed into a bottomless hole. And maybe you, who are watching now, have felt this way too, as if you had lost control, as if nothing made sense anymore. The news devastated the family. Her husband tried to be strong, but his eyes betrayed his fear. The children were still too young to understand, but she knew that the moments she would have with them could be counted. With each appointment, with each medical report, she felt hope slipping through her fingers. The medications were strong, the side effects were brutal, and the disease, relentless, seemed to laugh at the treatments. And at that moment, where one normally finds support, she felt alone. The prayers didn't seem to reach the ceiling. The dawns were long, silent, and full of dark thoughts. She began to wonder, has God forgotten me? Will my children grow up without a mother? Will my end be near? Maybe you've already asked these questions too. Maybe you are now in your room, silent, not knowing what else to do, thinking you have reached your limit. And it was exactly there, at rock bottom, that something started to change, not in the surrounding scenery, but inside her. Through her tears, she remembered a simple prayer her grandmother said when things seemed impossible. Lord, I don't have the strength, but I trust that you are still in control. And that night, for the first time in weeks, she knelt, not to ask for healing, but to deliver. She said, God, I don't understand why all this is happening, but if there is still purpose in my life, show me. I can't fight alone anymore. It was a moment of surrender, a moment in which she gave up control and placed her pain in the hands of a God she no longer knew if she still listened to. But he listened. And it is at this point in the story that something extraordinary began to happen. Not because the illness disappeared overnight, but because the peace she so desperately sought began to fill her heart in an inexplicable way. A peace that didn't come from reports or medicine, but from a certainty. She was no longer alone. God was there. Gift, working behind the scenes. And maybe that's the hardest part to believe when everything seems lost. But this story will show you that God's action can begin just when we think it has come to an end. Have you ever felt this? Have you ever had that moment when there seemed to be no light at the end of the tunnel? Comment below with the word faith if you also believe that God can act in the impossible. I want to know if this message is reaching hearts that needed to hear it today. Because what's about to happen in this story will shake you in ways you may not be prepared for. If you think you've already seen impactful testimonies, wait until you see what God did in this woman's life after she handed everything into his hands. And if you've ever experienced moments when everything seemed lost, this part of the testimony will speak directly to you. Because what God began there, in that sincere and desperate prayer, was the beginning of a transformation that no one expected, not even herself. She didn't ask for a miracle. She asked for direction, and God responded with more than she imagined. But there was something she didn't know yet, something that was about to happen, and that would completely change the course of everything. And this is where we begin to see how God works in the details. The phone rang in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and the call seemed to be just another routine appointment. But it wasn't. The doctor on the other end of the line had a different voice this time. Firmer, more hopeful. There was a vacancy for an experimental treatment. It's a new program. Almost no one was accepted. But you were selected. That seemed too unlikely. She, without resources, with a clinical condition considered irreversible, now had the chance of a treatment that could at least bring quality of life. And it was at that moment that she realized perhaps God was already preparing this answer before she even prayed. What seemed like coincidence was, in fact, providence. The family was moved. There was a new shine in her eyes, even though the pain persisted. But now she had something you didn't see on exams. Hope. And maybe that's what you need today. Not a magic solution, but a sign that God is still in control. Because He is. Even when everything seems dark, even when the reports are negative, even when your strength runs out, God's action does not depend on our ability, but on our dedication. And that's what changed everything in her life. Do you believe that miracles still happen? Then write in the comments, I believe. Let's make this space a place of living faith, because her story didn't end here. What came next was even more impressive. And that's why you need to keep watching, because there is something in this story that will touch your soul, something that may be missing from your walk today. If you've felt anything different so far, stay with us. What God did in her life will show that even when it seems like there is no longer a path, He opens a road where there was only desert. The next part will show you how this treatment was just the beginning of a transformation that no doctor predicted, but that heaven had already prepared. And it all started with a simple act of faith. Despair settled in like a dark cloud that wouldn't go away, too heavy to ignore. Every minute seemed like an eternity, and each news from the doctors came like a new stab in the heart. She was no longer crying just because of the fear of loss, but because she felt completely alone, as if God had turned away. "Why me?" she repeated, almost in a whisper, next to her intubated husband's bed. The doctors had been clear. Medicine had done everything it could. There were no more resources. No more hope, at least not theirs. The illness advanced, his body weakened every day, and what was once a warrior full of life now seemed like a body waiting for its last breath. In her heart, something screamed. It wasn't just pain. It was a kind of silent revolt that made her walk through the hospital corridors without knowing for sure whether she wanted to scream or disappear. It had been weeks since she had barely eaten. She slept sitting up, her eyes fixed on the machines, as if she could find a divine answer in them. And even when I left that cold clinical environment, the house felt like an abandoned war camp. Silence. Old photos scattered around the room only made the pain worse. Home had become a memorial of what life had been, and what she feared would never be again. She sought God, yes, but let's be honest, who has never experienced a moment like this? Who has never had that bitter feeling of praying, but feeling like the sky was bronze? That your words hit the ceiling and came back, as if God had put your life on hold mode. This wasn't just a test of faith, it was a spiritual battlefield, because behind every human diagnosis there was a detail that doctors didn't see. Her heart was waging war against discouragement, against doubt, against hopelessness. And maybe you understand what she felt. Maybe you've already knelt down, cried out, and still had the impression that everything was only getting worse. Have you ever felt abandoned by God, even though you know, deep down, that He never abandons anyone? But when the pain tightens, when time passes and the miracle doesn't come, even the strongest weaken, and it was exactly there, at that rock bottom, that she had her breaking point. One of those moments when the soul seems to scream, either God does something now, or I can't take it anymore. You know, it was no longer a question of accepting or fighting, of making promises or bargaining. She had already done everything. I had already asked for prayer in groups. I had already fasted. I had already prayed in the early hours of the morning, trying to calm my heart. I had already done campaigns and more campaigns. But what no one knew was that inside her something was breaking. And sometimes it is this breaking that brings us closer to heaven than any liturgy, because God cannot resist a contrite heart, and he was seeing what no one saw. She had a conversation with God that was not beautiful. There were no verses quoted or flowery words. It was sincere. It was tough. It was between sobs and incomplete sentences. It was a help me and I don't know what else to do, a take care because I can't do it anymore. And maybe you've had this conversation too. That kind of prayer that doesn't come out of the mouth but echoes in the soul. And that, my friend, is when the sky tilts. It was in this total vulnerability, in this emotional and spiritual exhaustion, that something began to change. Not in exams, not in the doctor's words, but in her. She didn't realize it right away, but that "I can't do it anymore" was, in fact, the password for God to start acting. Because while she was trying to take matters into her own hands, God was waiting for the moment when she would let go of control and let him guide her. Sometimes the miracle doesn't start outside, but inside us. It is the surrendered heart that activates the supernatural, and it was then that something different began to happen, not with noise, but with a strange, almost silent peace. As if, despite the chaos, something whispered inside her, "Trust, I'm here." Have you ever felt this? A type of consolation that does not come from circumstances, but from a presence. A certainty that, even without explanation, invades the chest and renews strength. She woke up that morning differently. There were still machines, there were still reports, but something inside had changed. And this change would be the beginning of the turnaround that no one expected. Because, in the spiritual realm, what man calls the end, God often calls the beginning. Medicine had already given up. Friends didn't know what else to say. Even family members were in embarrassed silence. But it was exactly in this scenario that God decided to write a new chapter. And hey, what happened next was something no one there could have predicted. In fact, let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment like this? When everything seemed lost, when you felt like you no longer had strength or faith, but still, something told you not to give up? Comment below. I really want to know if you've ever experienced a breaking point like this, because these types of stories have the power to touch lives and show that even in the worst times, there is still hope. What comes next in this story? You will see that it is impossible to doubt the power of God after this, because when everything said, "It's over," heaven declared, "Now it's my turn." And it was there, in that hospital room, with unresolved diagnoses, and a woman almost without faith, that the miracle began to unfold. But the way it happened was so surprising, so out of the ordinary, that even the doctors were speechless. It was in that silence, broken only by sobs, on the cold floor of the room, that something began to change. She no longer had human strength. There were no more plans. There was no more control. All that was left was a broken heart before a God who, until then, she thought, was silent. But in that moment, there was a real surrender, not that delivery of memorized words, of automatic prayers, but a deep surrender where tears spoke more than any rehearsed phrase. "If it is your will, heal me. But if it is not, give me peace to bear it," she said, with her voice breaking, her eyes red and her soul open. The Bible, open to Isaiah 53-5, seemed to shine amidst the darkness of the environment. "By his stripes we are healed." Those words, which she had read so many times without feeling, now seemed alive. They were a breath straight from heaven into your pain, and it was from there that everything started to move. It wasn't an instantaneous miracle, the kind that makes noise and leaves everyone in awe. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. But something had changed inside her. For the first time in a long time, she felt peace in the midst of the storm. A peace that did not come from the absence of problems, but from the certainty that even on the darkest days, God was there. She began to notice little things, the unexpected phone call from a friend who hadn't spoken to her in a while, the memory of a praise she used to sing when everything was going well, an invitation to go to church on Sunday. They were details, but each one of them felt like an answer. She accepted the invitation. She went to church with her heart still hurt, but something inside her pushed her. At the moment of praise, the words of that song seemed to tell exactly his story. She couldn't stop herself from crying. And as she sang with her eyes closed, she felt something different, a presence, strong, smooth, powerful. It was as if someone had embraced his soul. And there, among dozens of people, she understood that she was never alone. God has always been there, waiting for this moment, waiting to heal her from the inside out. That same week she woke up different. For the first time in months, he felt like getting out of bed. The weight on her shoulders was still there, but it no longer paralyzed her. There was a new strength. He began to truly seek God. I read the Bible no longer out of obligation, but out of hunger to hear his voice. He began writing prayers in a notebook, like someone talking to a close friend. And on every page, in every prayer, faith grew. She began to see God's actions in the smallest details. The doors that had been locked for so long began to open. A new treatment has appeared, more affordable and more effective. A Christian doctor looked at her and said, "You have more chances than you know. Don't give up now." But what surprised her most was what happened inside her own home. That daughter, who was so far away, started to get closer. One day, he entered his mother's room, saw the Bible open and asked, "Mom, can I pray with you?" That took her apart. The tears fell again, but this time they were of gratitude, because not only was God restoring his health, but he was also restoring his family. One prayer, said with sincerity and surrender, was changing everything, and she knew it wasn't a coincidence. As the transformation progressed, other miracles began to emerge. Her heart, once filled with doubt, was now fertile ground for hope. She began to testify, first shyly in conversations with friends, then in the church prayer group, and each time he told his story, he felt the power of God renewing not only his life, but that of those who listened. His words carried anointing, because they came from someone who lived through the valley, who touched rock bottom and was lifted by the invisible hand of a God who sees, who hears, who acts, even when everything seems lost. Can you imagine this? A life marked by pain now being used to heal others. A story of suffering becoming a source of faith for so many. This is how God works. He transforms shards into living testimonies. And if you're watching this video right now, maybe this story is speaking to you more than you'd like to admit. Maybe you too are at that point of brokenness. Maybe I've done everything I could, and now all I can do is trust. But let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment when you needed to trust God completely? Have you reached the end of your strength and, even without understanding, decided to give everything away? Tell us here in the comments. Your story could be the continuation of someone's miracle. Yes, your comment could be the answer someone else is waiting for, so they don't give up. And if this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share, subscribe to the channel, and like this video. This helps this message of hope and faith reach even more lives that need to hear that God still performs miracles, that he still transforms, and that no pain is greater than the power of his presence. And now, hold on tight, because what happened in the following days was something that not even she imagined. If you thought the story was impactful so far, just wait until you see what God did next. Days after that prayer, made with the heart in pieces, like someone giving one last scream before drowning, something inexplicable began to happen. It was not a loud noise, nor a supernatural revelation in an audible voice. It was peaceful, a peace that no one could explain. And this peace came as a silent sign that God had listened, that he was acting, even if nothing could yet be seen on the outside. The family, who before could barely sleep, started to feel something different. The wife reported that she woke up with a light heart, and the son, who cried almost every night, slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The following week, doctors ordered a new test, and it was at that moment that the unexpected revealed itself. Upon opening the envelope, the specialist, who had already warned about the seriousness of the situation, simply remained silent. His silence said more than any words. He looked at the images and clinical data and couldn't explain it. What was once an irreversible diagnosis was now a total absence. Nothing. No sick cells, no sign of the tumor, no plausible explanation according to medicine. What happened there can only be described with one word: miracle. And if you've ever felt like there was no way out, then you know what this family felt at that moment. A mix of relief, disbelief, and uncontrollable crying. It was as if the sky had tilted to touch that house, and this miracle didn't stop there. God not only healed the body, but began to restore everything around. The finances that were paralyzed, the contracts that had been shelved, began to move. People who previously turned away reappeared with requests for forgiveness, and faith, which for so long seemed dormant, was now alive, pulsating. They didn't just return to church, they became living witnesses of God's power. They started visiting hospitals, praying for people, sharing the story that seemed like an end, but that God transformed into a new beginning. And that's when you realize God's actions go far beyond what we ask. He doesn't just heal, he restores. He doesn't just answer, he transforms. Remember that pain that seemed unbearable? God used it exactly as a platform to show his glory, and that's how he works. It is often in the most silent moment, when we think that he has forgotten us, that he is preparing something supernatural, as it is written in John 11:40, "If you believe, you will see the glory of God." It was this faith, born of despair, that opened the doors to the impossible. And perhaps you, who are watching now, are precisely at that stage where you see no way out. But what if this pain you are experiencing is the beginning of a testimony that will impact lives? What if God is writing, at this very moment, the turning point in your story? This family story proves that nothing is lost when you leave everything in God's hands. What seemed like an end was the starting point for something much bigger. The transformation was complete. Emotional, spiritual, family. Because when God enters the scene, he doesn't do it piecemeal. He makes everything new. As it says in Isaiah 43:19, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it is coming to light. Do you not perceive it?" Sometimes we are so focused on the pain that we can't see the miracle coming. And here's a challenge for you. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever experienced a moment when everything seemed lost, but God intervened in an inexplicable way? Share here in the comments your testimony. It could be the spark of faith someone needs today. And if you haven't lived yet, but are waiting, then write too. Who knows, maybe this video is a harbinger of what God is about to do in your life. Because faith is not feeling, it is trusting. Even when you don't see it, even when everything says otherwise, while the world said it was impossible, God whispered, "Wait and trust." And the result was more than healing. It was transformation. And you know what's most beautiful? It's just that the same God who did it in that house wants to do it in yours too. No matter the diagnosis, the debt, the abandonment, the hidden pain, He continues to be the God of miracles. He continues to be the one who answers prayers made in tears, that honors broken hearts, who acts behind the scenes while we only see silence. And if you made it this far in this video, it wasn't by chance. Perhaps this testimony was the answer you asked for. Maybe this story will be the push you needed to start praying again, to believe again, to understand that yes, there is still a way, because when we trust in God, the impossible becomes just another chapter in our story with Him, and He writes like no one else. Do you believe this? In fact, tell me here, which part of this story spoke to you the most? Was it the moment of delivery, the cure, complete restoration? I want to read your comment, because those who witness activate the faith of those who listen, and faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Like, share and subscribe. This is a way to spread more hope, more renewal, more transformation. There are a lot of people who need this, and you can be the channel. But perhaps what impresses us most about this story is not the miracle itself, but the silent transformation that began to happen within him. Because while the world was screaming that it was the end, God was working behind the scenes, shaping the impossible. And that is precisely where the power of faith comes in. Not as an escape from reality, but as an anchor that sustains in the midst of the storm. When he declared in prayer, with tears streaming down his face, "Lord, I have nothing left, but if you want, you can still do something with my life." It was as if the heavens opened. Not immediately with applause or responses, but with a different peace, that peace that passes all understanding. The days that came after that were not magical. They were not easy, but they were marked by small confirmations. That God was there, an unexpected call, a door that opened, an inexplicable strength to continue. And maybe you're listening to this right now and feeling a tightness in your chest, an identification so strong that it feels like this story is yours. Because deep down, we've all been through moments when we thought it was the end, in which everything seemed lost, and the only thing left was emptiness. But see, even emptiness can be the space that God chooses to start something new. This is not just a story of overcoming. It's a story of reconnection from someone who tried everything with their own strength until they understood that only God could bring a true answer. And it wasn't just any answer, it was a complete healing, emotional, spiritual, and even physical. Because as the word says, by his stripes we are healed, Isaiah 53:5. That truth became real in that moment, not as a beautiful phrase in a verse, but as a living, palpable, transformative experience. The pain that seemed unbearable began to turn into testimony. Shame gave way to hope. Guilt turned to gratitude, and the most impactful, what he feared most, failure, abandonment, loneliness, became the stage for the greatest miracle of his life. God didn't just restore what had been lost. He delivered something new, bigger, different, a new mission, a new purpose. He started to help other people, to tell what he experienced, and to be an answer for those who were also at rock bottom. Because those who are healed by God often become healers in the lives of others. And now, perhaps the most important question is not what happened to him, but what could happen to you. Because if God did this in his life, why wouldn't he do it in yours? Have you handed your problems, your pains, your fears into his hands? Or have you been trying to solve everything on your own until you run out? Maybe this video came to you as a sign. Maybe this is the time to stop fighting against it and start truly trusting. The same faith that moved mountains in his life can transform your reality. The question is, are you ready to trust? Perhaps you are now facing one of those pains that silence the soul, an irreparable loss, a broken marriage, a diagnosis that no one can explain, a bill that won't close, or an anguish that seems to have no name. God knows every detail. He saw every tear that no one else saw, and even when you thought he was far away, he was there, working behind the scenes, waiting for the moment when you surrendered, because it is in surrender that the miracle happens. And we are not talking about cold religiosity, about memorized words, but about a real encounter with the living God. And if you got here, it wasn't by chance. Perhaps what you needed to hear most today was, there is still hope. No matter how dark your scenario is, God is an expert at turning nights into mornings. He makes rivers spring up in the desert. He restores what no one else believes. And when everything seems lost, that's when he begins to write the most beautiful pages of our history. Do you believe this? Now tell me, what would you do in his place? Could you give up control, even without understanding the plan? Have you ever had a moment when all you had left was to trust God? Share with me here in the comments, because it may be that your testimony, even if it is still in process, will inspire someone who is thinking about giving up today. Don't keep it to yourself. Testimonials have power, and sometimes all a person needs to keep going is to hear that someone one day went through something similar and overcame it. If this story spoke to you in some way, like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is not just about numbers. It's about allowing more people to be reached by messages of faith, miracle, and transformation. Every click of yours makes this message reach further, touch more hearts, renew more hope, because God's actions are revealed in the details, including in each share, in each comment, in each decision to spread the word. And remember, faith does not eliminate struggles, but it gives us strength to go through them. And it is in this crossing that we find the true miracle. Your story is not over yet. God is still writing, and if you let him, he can turn the next page into something you never imagined. So stay here with us, because what comes next might be exactly the answer you've been waiting for. But on that particular night, something inside him broke differently. It was no longer just the weight of debts, nor the shame of facing his wife, his children, his friends. It was a dull, deep pain, as if the very air was against him. Lying on the cold floor of the room, he looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "God, if you really exist, show me. I can't take it anymore." The silence that followed seemed to scream. The dark house, the sound of the clock marking each second as if mocking his agony. Everything seemed to conspire against any hope. But in that honest surrender, in that plea murmured through tears and sobs, the sky moved. He didn't see a light, he didn't hear an audible voice, but a different peace, subtle, soft, touched his chest. It was as if, even without an immediate response, God was saying, "I am here, and I have never abandoned you." In the following days, nothing changed on the outside. There were still bills piled up on the table. There were still suspicious looks. There was still the echo of bankruptcy knocking on the door, but inside him, something was starting to move. For the first time in a long time, he began to truly pray. Not those automatic, empty prayers, but sincere, torn conversations. And the more he talked to God, the more he found himself talking to someone who listened to him. It was one of those early mornings in prayer that he felt something different. It was not a vision nor a grand revelation, but an idea, a memory, an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years, who worked with social projects and who had once said, "If one day you want to start over, I believe in you." That phrase came back to him as if it had been whispered again, and he decided to try. With his heart racing and his hands shaking, he sent a message. It was just a hi, but behind that hi, there was a whole soul begging for a sign. And the signal came. Not only was the response positive, but that friend seemed to have been waiting for exactly this moment. "Man, I'm glad you talked to me today. I was praying for someone who could help me with a new project that God placed on my heart." Can you imagine this? At the moment he thought it was the end, God was already preparing a new beginning. The connection happened, the opportunity arose, and little by little that man began to rise again. It wasn't magical. It didn't happen overnight, but each small step was a miracle disguised as a process. Each new door that opened was as if heaven said, "I heard you that night. I heard every tear." And something incredible started to happen. People he thought had forgotten him started looking for him. A former supplier offered products on consignment. A distant cousin, touched by a preaching video he had shared, made a donation. A neighborhood pastor invited him to give a brief testimony. Give testimony. He who had nothing but bankruptcy, pain, and unanswered questions. But there, at the improvised altar of that small neighborhood church, with a choked voice and watery eyes, he began to tell what God had done. And as he spoke, the words came with life, with strength. Because it wasn't him trying to convince anyone. It was the Holy Spirit himself translating each scar into faith, each loss into purpose. And you know what else? People cried, people were touched, people came up to him after the service and said, "I thought God had forgotten me. But hearing your story, I saw that there is still hope." It spread. An amateur video of the testimony ended up in prayer groups. A cell leader shared with the church, and so the one who was broken, rejected, considered a failure even by himself, became an instrument. The man who said, "I'm not even good for myself," was now serving as a bridge between heaven and afflicted hearts. All because, at his worst moment, he did what few can do. He surrendered. He recognized that he could no longer do it alone. And it was in this delivery that the miracle began. God didn't just restore him financially. Although doors opened and he rediscovered his professional dignity, God restored him from within. Today, he says with conviction, "The greatest miracle I experienced was not making money again. It was feeling peace again even before the money appeared. It was going back to sleep without needing tranquilizers. It was going back to praying with my children and feeling the presence of God in the room." Do you understand the power of this? It's not just about having a new chance in your career. It's about having a new chance in your soul. God pulled him out of the mud, not just to clean him up, but to make him a living example of what faith can do when all seems lost. And today, every word he says is loaded with an authority that doesn't come from diplomas or titles, but from healed scars, of tears that turned into testimony. And you? Are you waiting for a miracle? Have you given your fears and pains to God? Faith moves mountains and transforms lives. Every testimony like this is proof of God's action. Like the video, subscribe to the channel and share with someone who needs to hear this message. There is power in every click that spreads faith. There is renewal in every story that reaches a tired heart. God still turns tears into healing, pain into renewal, impossible things into new beginnings. And if you're listening to this right now, it's not by chance. There's a reason you've come this far. The world is screaming, the signs are everywhere, wars, diseases, instability, uncertainty on all sides. These are difficult times, prophetic times, and more than ever, it is essential to be sensitive to what God is doing. Each testimony like this is more than a story of overcoming. It's a warning, a calling, one spiritual awakening for those who are distracted. Because while many are entertained by the chaos, God continues speaking. He is preparing his people. He is warning that time is running out. You need to be among those who they still have ears to hear and eyes to see. That's why, don't keep this message to yourself. Like this video now, because when you do, YouTube understands that this content is relevant and starts showing it to other people who may be experiencing the same despair. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Here you will find real testimonies, surprising transformations, and words that will strengthen your faith in the days to come. It's not just a click. It's about being prepared to feed your soul with hope, with truth, with faith. The end is closer than we imagine, and every time God performs a miracle, He is also saying, there is still time to return, to believe, to trust. Are you ready to see what God did in this woman's life when everything seemed lost? So stay with us, because what's coming now is the beginning of a miracle that even doctors couldn't explain.